excited to have a full house with us here today at the Jefferson School African American Heritage Center. And we also have viewers who are tuning in online, so hello to all of you out there as well. We're excited to have you join us. Before we begin, as you all are probably aware, I have a few things I need to run over. First, we want to thank our sponsors of today's program. So we have the Sentara Martha Jefferson Hospital, we have Ragged Mountain Running Shop, and we have my department, African American Programs at Virginia Humanities. So please join me in thanking our sponsors. If you're live tweeting or live Facebooking today's program, please use the hashtag VABookFest. So VA Book Fest. Those of you who are at home watching, I have my laptop here, so if you want to ask a question using that hashtag, I'll try my best to check at the Q&A portion of the program. So again, VA Book Fest, and if you're live streaming, feel free to ask questions online. We also want to remind you that the festival is free of charge, not free of cost, so please remember to go online, give back, you pick up a donation envelope at the Omni information desk. And we also have evaluations, and we really encourage you to please fill out an evaluation that you see on the yellow form. That helps us continue to make the festival as great as possible, and we want to make sure that we're responsive to your feedback. So please fill out that evaluation. All right, so today we have two incredible writers, professors, and scholars for our program entitled Overcoming the Odds, Biographies of Great American Leaders. So we have with us, to my immediate left here, Raymond Arsenault. And Raymond Arsenault is the author of Arthur Ashe, A Life. He is a John Hope Franklin Professor of Southern History at the University of Southern California, St. Petersburg. Oh, excuse me, not Southern California. I'm getting into the book. He is a professor of history at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, and one of the nation's leading civil rights historians who is the author of several acclaimed prize-winning books. And we'll get to Southern California later as we discuss Arthur Ashe's career. And we also have with us Professor David Blight, who is the author of Frederick Douglass. He is the class of 1954 professor of American history and director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University. He is the author and editor of a dozen books and has been awarded the Bancroft Prize, the Abraham Lincoln Prize, and the Frederick Douglass Prize, among others. Please join me in welcoming our two authors. So I know some people were probably wondering why in the world did we pair these two books. I mean, we're looking at two different centuries, two very different men, but both Ashe and Douglass really represent, I think, some really important commonalities, and that is that continuous fight to improve this country and to decrease and dismantle racism by different means, but effective means, and witness in their lifetime successes and some challenges that we still experience today. Both men represent a wide spectrum of black ideology when it comes to activism. They also represent the diversity that exists within varying movements. And so I asked both of our guests today to begin by simply sharing either an anecdote or a favorite excerpt from each of their books. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Arsenault.
Well, I'm really pleased to be here. And just in the interest of disclosure, I think David and I have more in common than just our subjects. We've been close friends for many years, and we have the same agent, Wendy Strothman, who's in the audience. We have the same editor, and Bob Bender, the same publisher, and we shared a very dear friend who actually, one of the people that I dedicated my book to, James Horton, died 2 years ago of a terrible brain condition. He was one of David's closest friends and one of mine. So we're kind of partners in crime, and we really were excited to be able to be on the same panel today. I guess the anecdote I want to start with is the first one in my book. It's in the prologue, And I think it, in some ways, is consistent with the theme of this session about essentially figures who become great leaders, but who started from a very low base. Certainly, Arthur Ashe, I think, fills that description. So when I was just starting research on this book, and the book took 9 years to write, 9 long years. I wasn't sure I'd ever finish it. The trajectory of his life, you know, which was so heroic and extraordinary, and then he died of AIDS at the age of 49, just after adopting this young baby who became the light of his life, and then he died. And so sometimes it was emotionally difficult to try to work my way through the downside of his life. But when I was beginning, I was actually at a friend's book launch party on Martha's Vineyard. A woman named Pat Sullivan, who'd done this wonderful book on the history of the NAACP called Lift Every Voice. And it was an outdoor party celebrating her book, and there were several hundred people. And I noticed this African-American woman, a little bit older than most people there, was by herself, and she didn't seem to know anybody. And so I went up and I introduced myself. And I was just about to go to Newport, to the International Tennis Hall of Fame, to start my research a couple days later. So I told her this. And this is a cocktail party now. So she says, well, have I got a story for you? So I wasn't expecting to work at this party. But it turns out her name... I actually spilled my drink. But her name was Doris Kamek. And when she was a young girl, 15 years old, she was touted as the next Althea Gibson. Althea Gibson, of course, the great, the original Serena Williams, right? Who was the best player in the world in the mid-1950s. So this is 1955, and Doris they're touting her as the next great player among African-American girls, and so she's playing in this tournament in Washington, D.C., and the organizers come up to her at the beginning and say, Doris, we're so sorry, but we only have an odd number of girls in the draw, so we don't have anyone to play you in the first round. However, there's this little boy, you know where this is going, I'm sure. There's this little boy who, he agreed to play you. And she said, well, how little is he? I said, well, he's 11, and he's very small. Actually, he weighed less than 70 pounds at the time. His arms and legs were like, you know, pipe cleaners. And she said, well, I'm not going to play that baby. You know, that's embarrassing. I said, oh, please, don't embarrass him. He agreed to play with you. Just get around with him for a few minutes. Finally, she says, okay, I guess I'll do it. So then Arthur, little boy, comes out, and he's even smaller than she expected. She says, well, I'm not playing that baby. You know, finally, they prevailed upon her to actually play this kind of early battle of the sexes. It's not quite Bobby Riggs against Billie Jean King, but of course, you know what happened later. He just destroyed her. She hardly won a point in 2 sets. And she told me, as the tears started streaming down her face, this is a woman in her mid-70s at this point, but clearly this is an anecdote that really meant a lot to her. She said, so I walked up to the net to congratulate him, and I had to reach over and down over the net to shake his hand. And she said, he looked up at me, and all I can say is his face was like the angelic assassin. He wasn't surprised at all that he was beating everybody, and it was no big deal to him, and he had this kind of inner confidence, this sort of self-respect that Arthur always had. And she quit tennis after that. She told me she thought she'd make her way in another way. She gave up being the next Althea Gibson, but of course, as she said, this was probably the greatest moment in her life. And she later became friends with Arthur, and like many people, came to respect him as an extraordinary human being. So that's how I began my research with Doris Kamek.
Wow. I never met anybody that played Douglass in tennis. That I know of. First of all, thank you, Justin. Thank you to the book festival. I'm thrilled to be here with my old friend, Reid. What he didn't tell you is that our dear friend Jim Horton looked just like Arthur Ashe. And I'm not kidding. We used to be running around airports with Jim, and people would come up, Arthur? No. Anyway, thanks for the memory. I'll tell you a quick anecdote, too, that is at the beginning of my book, now that I think about it. And it has everything to do with why I wrote the biography. I wrote my first book once upon a time on Douglass. It was a dissertation in graduate school. It was kind of a thin little intellectual biography. I went on and edited editions of his autobiographies, wrote essays on Douglass, et cetera, et cetera. But I had Douglass out of my life, I thought, forever. Truly, and I wanted it that way. Until about 12 years ago, I went to Savannah, Georgia, of all places, to give a talk to high school teachers on Douglass's narrative, his first autobiography, which I've done many times. And my host was the Georgia Historical Society, and its director said, there's a local gentleman here who's a collector, and he'd like to meet you and maybe have lunch. And I don't know what I said. My reaction, I think, was something like, yeah, I guess so. And at lunch, I met the most extraordinary man. His name is Walter Evans. If you've opened my book at all, my book is dedicated to Walter and Linda Evans, and another dear friend of mine who died just a year ago. At any rate, Walter is an African-American retired surgeon who grew up in segregated Savannah, went north for his higher education, went to the University of Michigan Medical School, and practiced as a general surgeon in Detroit for over 30 years. I grew up in Flint, Michigan, so he and I had Detroit in common. Although Walter used to have season tickets to the Tigers games, we never could afford them. At any rate, Walter started collecting African-American rare books, manuscripts, and art in the 1970s. It is and was and always has been the passion of his life. That and surgery. But he, as he always jokes, he did surgery so he could collect. And a lot of people do things so they can do something else. At any rate, in his house, he has a fantastic collection of African-American manuscripts and rare books and art, although much of his art is now being moved to the Savannah School of Art and Design, where they built an entire wing of a building with his name on it. But that day, he took me to his house, and he got out on his dining room table a major portion of his Douglass collection. And I didn't decide on that, it might be a cool story to tell you. I decided that moment I was going to write A New Life of Douglass. I didn't, because it was daunting. Like Arthur Ashe, it's a big life. Douglass is a big subject. I didn't want to take this on. And I waited a while. And I realized, well, if I don't do it, though, somebody else will. The collection, the core of Walter's collection, is about 10 very large Douglass family scrapbooks that were kept by Douglass's children, especially two of his adult sons, over the last 30, 35 years of their father's life. And quite an array of family letters and documents of all kinds, and photographs, and other items about the Douglass family. What that collection gave me access to, and I was not the first to see it, but I was the first to use it. Now several other Douglass scholars have gone through Walter's initiation and worked on his dining room table. But what it gave me access to is the last third of Douglass's life. If you know Douglass at all, he's born in 1818 in a backwater of the eastern shore of Maryland, along the Horseshoe Bend and the Tuckahoe River. He lives till 1895, 77 years. He lives that entire trajectory of the American story of slavery, its destruction and all-out Civil War, the Reconstruction era, the year of the Gilded Age, Jim Crow and lynching. He lives that entire trajectory of, in some ways, the most pivotal issue of certainly the 19th century in America. But if Americans know something about Frederick Douglass at all, they tend to know the young Douglass, the heroic Douglass who escapes from slavery, becomes the great orator, writes a classic autobiography, then rewrites a second classic autobiography, and maybe they've heard that he had something to do with helping the country think about emancipation in the Civil War. But they don't tend to know anything about that older Douglass. The man who lives 30 years after the war, the man who's the old radical outsider, who becomes the political insider, who was the former abolitionist who now becomes a Republican Party functionary after the Civil War. A man who lives long enough to see the great triumph of his life, which he experienced in his 40s. And how many radical reformers actually live to see their cause win in the middle of life, and then live long enough to see that cause being eroded, betrayed, maybe even all but destroyed? That last third of his life is what this collection opened up as never before. And that's why I did the book. I spent many spring breaks in Savannah, a lot of other weeks. I've never been to a better archive than Lyndon and Walter Evans' dining room table. They had only 2 rules. Don't come before 8 a.m., which was easy. And never put your coffee cup on the same table with the documents. Other than that, I had free rein. I could stay as long as I wanted at night, and I often did. And it's the most extraordinary research experience I'm sure I will ever have. But Walter Evans is the reason I did this book. And it opened up a window into Douglass like we had never had before. And I'll add one little anecdote to that. That last third of Douglass's life is when he becomes the patriarch, really, of a huge extended family. 4 surviving adult children, 21 grandchildren, at least 3 fictive siblings who adopted him or he adopted them, and a whole variety of other hangers-on who were always around Douglass. And virtually all of them were financially dependent upon him the last 25 years of his life. Douglass woke up every day that last third of his life wondering, what can I do today to support this huge brood that I'm responsible for? And as Ray knows as well as I do, or any biographer knows, you have to find the balance in this craft between the public person, if you're working on a great public person, and the private person. Somehow find that balance. And that Evans collection gave me material we'd never had before to understand Douglass's family and how complicated it really was. I have other anecdotes, but I'll save it.
Yeah, we'll get into that. But I want to continue along this vein because I know I grew up knowing of Ashe, knowing of Douglass, and viewing them for most of my life as heroes. But I realized that I for most of my life at least, I had this almost like Black History Month, elementary school bulletin board understanding of both of them. And it really is so much more that the larger public fails to understand. And I'm really curious to know, especially Professor Arsenault, what else did you feel we needed to know? These are 2 men who were very conscious of their history making. They went at great lengths to really perpetuate a certain self-image. I mean, as far as writing 3 memoirs or biographies apiece, like they both wrote about themselves extensively. What was missing from all of that? Why were these biographies needed?
Well, maybe I should go back to the origins of this book. I happen to know the sports writer Frank DeFord, and familiar, many of you, Sports Illustrated writer, who's a dear friend of Arthur's. And I knew him, and I approached him about Jeannie Ashe, Arthur's widow, whether I could talk to her, whether she would help me. And he said, well, I don't know. She's very protective of his legacy, and she won't just talk to everyone. And but he gave me her contact information, and I contacted Jeannie, and I told her I was a civil rights historian. I love sports, I love tennis, but I'm not a sports writer. I'm a civil rights historian, and that's the way I wanted to approach Arthur's story. And that seemed to open everything up with her. She sort of gave me the keys to the kingdom and helped me on and off throughout the 9 years and opened up a kind of internal world of not only their life together, but of who Arthur really was. I tried to give as much material in the book as tennis fans perhaps would want. Probably too much for non-tennis fans, but trying to balance it with his life as a public intellectual. And that's really what he was, more than any other person in sports. He transcended the world of sports, transcended the world of tennis. He and Muhammad Ali, probably more than any other figures of their day. I mean, here's a man who was compulsive about doing the New York Times crossword puzzle every day, even when he was in the locker room. There are funny stories of Jimmy Connors coming over and saying, "What are you doing, Arthur?" And trust me, Jimmy Connors was not helping Arthur finish the crossword. He collected first editions. He was a true intellectual, very well read, interested in everything, incredibly generous spirit, always giving of his time. He never said no. If you look at his daily logbooks, it's just extraordinary that any human being could do as much as he did in terms of inner city workshops and various philanthropic things, and any civil rights struggle, he was there. In fact, my favorite anecdote in the book, sad really, but in September of 1992, he's known he's had AIDS for 4 years. You know he doesn't have very long to live. He was 6'1", 155 pounds was his normal playing weight, always throughout his life. He was down to 128 pounds. Just shriveled up. And he grew up with a man named Randall Robinson in Richmond, of course. And Randall Robinson went on to become a very prominent anti-apartheid activist, organized something called Trans-Africa, and he and Arthur did it together. And they were having a big rally in front of the White House to protest the George H.W. Bush administration's policy towards Haitian boat people. It was very prejudicial. They were doing all kinds of things for Cubans, but not for dark-skinned Haitians. So it was a pretty obvious cause to throw yourself into, but so Randall calls Arthur in New York and says, "It would mean so much to me if you would come down and be part of this demonstration." Well, you can imagine Arthur's wife, Jeannie, says, "You're crazy to go. You're going to kill yourself." And his doctor said, "Absolutely, under no circumstances should you go down there." But Arthur said, "Well, I've got to. I can't let Randall down. This is too important a cause." So he goes down. There are 3,000 people there in front of the White House picketing. 100 of them are arrested, including Arthur. And there are pictures in my book of him being handcuffed and taken off to jail. He bails out the next day, and he goes back to New York, and he has a massive heart attack.
Wow.
Predictably. Doesn't kill him, but he lived a few weeks longer and died of pneumonia, causes related to AIDS. But I always thought this story about that he wouldn't pass off the responsibility to anyone else, not to the next generation. He was the only professional athlete there, which I think is the other important point here. He was always trying to get other athletes to speak out, to be truth tellers, to forget about what their coaches and their owners would tell them, that Republicans buy shoes too, as Michael Jordan once told us. So you don't want to alienate part of your fan base. You don't want to be too vocal. You don't want to be too political. And of course, Arthur was famous for being a paragon of civility and sportsmanship. He never raised his voice. He never got angry. He never held a grudge. But in his gut, he had the fire to tell the truth as he saw it. And in fact, a few weeks later, just one more anecdote, and I'll turn it over to David. The day before he died, he's on a breathing machine. He knows he only has a few hours to live. He can't speak, of course, and he asks for a note. He motions to his wife and give him a notepad, and he writes out this little note that please call President Clinton, who had just been inaugurated, and tell him, please appoint a very pro-civil rights attorney general. That's the last thing he did.
Wow.
That's the last time he was thinking of before he died. So I always thought that spoke volumes about the extraordinary character which somehow he developed throughout his lifetime.
All right, just keep going.
Wow.
Well, we do have a lot of parallels here, and you mentioned the autobiographies, the self-creation, self-fashioning. Douglass wrote 3 famously autobiographies. He wrote 1,200 pages of autobiography. And the third one he revised again 10 years later into a 4th. So, as a biographer, the first rule there is never trust anybody who writes 3 autobiographies because they are manipulating you on every page. And Douglass did. He was a genius with words. Words are one of the primary 6 or 7 themes of my book. We wouldn't be here talking about Douglass were it not for his language, his mastery of words. There's a whole history of how that came about. He wasn't born some genius with words. Nobody is. You have to learn it. But he kept fashioning his own story over time. And those autobiographies are indispensable as a source. But as a biographer, you have to treat them both as source and subject. You have to also explain, why does someone keep writing his own story over and over and over? Why does he seem to believe he only has one great story to tell, and it's all about him? And then, of course, you have to deal with the question. And I'm curious how you had to work this dance with Arthur Ashe. Douglass's 1,200 pages of autobiography has almost nothing about his private life. Now, it has a great deal that is revealing about his youth as a slave. That's why that first narrative is now such a worldwide text. It's taught all over the world. It's translated in many languages. It's the greatest of the slave narratives. He does reveal a great deal about his youth. But when it comes to adulthood, and it comes to his public life, his family's not there. His relationships with friends, only to a small extent, are there. Friends and rivals and enemies. His relationships with women. His relationships with his sons and daughter, which are so rich and important and difficult at times. They're not there. In 1,200 pages, there's one mention of his first wife, Anna. He was married to Anna for 44 years, and she's called my wife. He doesn't even get her name. His second wife, Helen, gets a little more of a mention, but that's mostly as Douglass was telling about their 11-month tour of Europe and the Mediterranean in 1886. So Douglass, the crafty memoirist, is always there trying to control his own story. He's very good at it. So you have to find the side doors. You have to see under and through and around those autobiographies at the same time you use them. And happily, we do have quite a stash of letters. You're always wishing for more letters when you do biography, of anyone in the 19th century at least. God only knows how they're going to do biography of people living today, because email and social media and all the rest. I'm glad I'm going to be calm before whatever happens, I suppose. And there's a great number of, not a great number, a sufficient number of letters between Douglass and his adult children that you can get at the nature of that relationship of father to son and father to daughter, which was so important. And I'll also just say, too, that Douglass was so determined to, and he had a responsibility, not unlike I'm sure Arthur Ashe felt, a tremendous weight of carrying this burden of the race, burden of being spokesman. For Frederick Douglass, this was the burden of his life, the responsibility of his life. Everywhere he went, every word he spoke, every word he wrote was representative of his people. Now, he wanted it that way most of the time. And then there are also many times when you can hear and see Douglass just wishing to hide. At priceless moments in letters to his daughter or a son or even a granddaughter saying, "Oh, wish I was back at Cedar Hill," that's his house in Washington, "sitting by the fireplace and just eating a peach. You know, just sitting in my favorite chair eating a peach." Because Douglass I can't prove it, but I just speculate in the book, probably traveled more miles than any other American of the 19th century, with one possible exception, and that's Mark Twain. But Twain lived 10 years into the 20th century. Besides, he cheated by going to Asia. Douglass never stopped doing these endless speaking tours. Way into his late life, the last year of his life, he's touring across the northern states with his speech on lynching, called Lessons of the Hour. And Douglass probably spoke to more people. This one I'm quite confident of. Again, I can't prove it. Probably spoke to more people. More people heard Frederick Douglass as an orator than anyone else in the 19th century. Even Emerson, who did these endless Chautauqua tours. Emerson didn't draw the audience as Douglass did. So there was this responsibility to always be there with your voice. And the voice did not always work. Both physically, he sometimes would just lose his voice. And there'd be a little column in a local newspaper, which, by the way, those scrapbooks are just full of local newspapers. The family hired a clipping service in the 1880s. So everywhere the old man went, back came a clipping from whatever town he went to. I didn't even know there were clipping services in the 19th century. The Douglass family found them. There'd be a little column, Mr. Douglass has lost his voice, he will not speak on Thursday. We hope he will speak on Friday. You know, Mr. Douglass's throat ailment has come back again. He will try to speak tomorrow, and so on. But also sometimes a speech just bombed out. And you love that when you realize how good this guy could be. He took, for example, and I'll pass it back to Reid, but after the Civil War, particularly, all of his speeches were written out in text, and eventually in typescript. This was not just some sermonizing orator who went in and blew out the lights in a hall spontaneously off the top of his head. He wrote out these speeches very carefully. We have text of all of them. In fact, I'm utterly convinced of this about Douglass, that he often didn't know what he thought about something until he went to his desk and wrote it down, like a lot of us. What are you really thinking about something? I don't know yet. I gotta take some notes. I gotta write it. And then he'd go out and deliver it from text. And the older he got, the more he got worried that he needed to stay with his text. I can relate to that too. But last point, he got concerned that he wasn't being taken quite seriously enough as an intellectual. He's always insecure about that. No formal education whatsoever. Never set foot in a schoolroom in his life, although he became quite an advocate and theorist about education. So in 1869, he decided he was going to do a history lecture for this winter's tour on the circuit. And for reasons I still don't entirely understand, he wrote up a big, long, 25-page lecture on William the Silent of the Netherlands. William the Silent was the monarch who helped the Dutch realize democracy and so on. And he thought this was a heroic figure out of Europe. He was going to show his chops in European history. And the speech wasn't working. It just kind of bombed on him. And when you read it, you see why. It's kind of detailed. Good God, Frederick, what are you doing? And he's out on the tour giving William the Silent, and he's in Iowa City. I don't know why I remember this, but he's in Iowa City, sitting in a train station, and the reporters were always following him. And the reporter, for some reason I remember, was from a Milwaukee newspaper. And the reporter came up to him and said, "Mr. Douglass, you didn't seem to quite have it last night." That's the way the reporter says it anyway. And Douglass admits to him that maybe this history lecture isn't working as well as he thought it might. Sorry about that. And then he says something like, "Besides, if I really belt it out like I used to, I have false teeth now and I might lose my teeth." But then he shows another part of his sense of humor. The reporter asks him, "So, Mr. Douglass, you do these tours endlessly. What's the hardest part of being out here on your lecture circuit?" Douglass's answer was, "Having to speak to people like you." Anyway, William the Silent wasn't working, but he didn't lose his sense of humor.
You know, this is so instructive to David and I have been on panels together before, but never about these two books. And
Yeah, we're going to do this more.
it's striking me how many parallels there are between these two. These two men lived in different centuries, but had an awful lot in common. So one difference I would say, well, you'd say, Arthur was also incredibly deliberative. He was, I think, he made himself into a fine speaker, but he was an even better listener. Many of the 150 interviews that I did for the book, they kept reiterating that he was the best listener. He would never interrupt. He always waited for people to speak their mind. He really wanted to filter all of it through. I think something maybe that we could take a lesson from today in our turbulent time. But as to his autobiographies, he did 4 actually. Believe it or not, even though he lived to be 49. And he was amazingly candid about his private life.
That's the 20th century. They don't do that in the 19th century.
Quite extraordinary. I mean, he could have filled all the gossip magazines, probably. But and there were two stories that I want to mention to you. One, he grew up in Richmond, cradle to grave segregation, classic Jim Crow in his years. Most of the best tennis courts in Richmond were in Byrd Park, public park. All white, of course, and his father actually was kind of the manager of Brookfield Park, which was the largest black park. And that's how Arthur became a tennis player. His mother died when he was 6, and he was just devastated by this. Withdrew, wasn't speaking for a while. He would sit out on the porch, which their house was in the park. And there were 4 tennis courts about 50 feet away. And there was a young man named Ronald Charity, who was a 19-year-old student at Virginia Union, a historically black college, and saw this pitiful little boy and tried to coax him out to play tennis. Charity was probably the best tennis player self-taught in Richmond, and he was giving lessons. And he finally got Arthur out there, never thinking in a million years that this kid would become a world-class athlete. He was just trying to help him. Arthur grew up in Brookfield Park, but he never played at Byrd Park, which didn't desegregate, I think, until 1962. He would often say, nothing, Arthur, as I said, almost never got mad, but one thing that did infuriate him, when someone from Richmond would come up to him anywhere in the world, Paris, London, Melbourne, wherever, and he'd say, "Oh, Arthur, we're so proud of you. I'm from Richmond. You made us so proud. I used to love to watch you play at Byrd Park when you were a boy." And so he talks about that in one of his autobiographies. But he also mentions that a bit of compensation. He admits that at 16 years old, he lost his virginity in the parking lot at Byrd Park. So sort of don't get mad, get even.
What did Douglas have told me?
Yeah, in fact, one of the complications of doing the biography, because I worked so closely with Jeannie Ashe, and Arthur was a very eligible bachelor for a very long time and dated some of the most beautiful, intelligent women in the world, and fashion models, and all kinds of people, other tennis players from places like Sweden, and it was a bit controversial at the time, but so I had to kind of go through this. I would read some of the manuscript out loud to Jeannie to see if I were making any particular mistakes or there's something she wanted to add. And we would get to the girlfriends and I would just kind of start blushing. But I must say she handled it better than I did. But I was very thankful for that, because when I started the book, I was afraid, because he was known as such a great sportsman. He wasn't John McEnroe, right? Although he was very close to McEnroe, and he was McEnroe's captain when McEnroe was #1 in the world playing Davis Cup for the United States, and Arthur was the captain, and McEnroe was driving him crazy, and he was in his super brat, stage then. But when I interviewed McEnroe at the U.S. Open, he said, "God, I was such a jerk in those days. Please don't try to make me even more of a jerk than I was." But Arthur once said, because there was a lot of pressure for him to throw McEnroe off of the Davis Cup team. They won the first 2 Davis Cups when Arthur was captain, but a lot of people thought this is insulting to the United States to have this sort of poor sport leading the U.S. Davis Cup team. Arthur never did throw him off, and it was very controversial, but I think in part because he loved McEnroe's fighting spirit, that he was always there. He never made up any excuses. He'd lose his temper, but it was all in this kind of the goal of playing the best tennis he possibly could. So Arthur once said, you know, I would love to be John McEnroe for 24 hours. I would love to go to Wimbledon and throw my racket, break my racket, swear at the referees, do everything that Arthur Ashe would never do, you know, to let it all out. And but he admitted, I know I'll never do that. And I think in the same way that Jackie Robinson paid a huge price for having to keep his anger in those first 2 years with the Brooklyn Dodgers, when Branch Rickey made him promise that he wouldn't fight back, he wouldn't speak back. I think Arthur had a lot of that. Exterior, he was always so calm and cool. Life magazine had a title, front page, was The Icy Elegance of Arthur Ashe, after he won the first US Open in 1968. But I think underneath that icy elegance, there was a tremendous turmoil that he never satisfied himself. I think in particular, he was, you know, like a lot of young athletes, before he turned 25, he was sort of self-absorbed. He was fighting his way up the ladder. His father told him, don't get involved with that civil rights mess. You know, keep your mouth shut. Just keep your eye on the ball. But from 1968 on, he was a full-time activist. And as he once said, you know, he knew that when he was striking tennis balls at these country clubs, he was the only black, of course, there, that other young black men and women were braving the fire hoses and the attack dogs in Richmond, and they were in the Selma to Montgomery March. And as he once said, as my fame rose, so did my anguish. As my fame rose, so did my anguish. And I think he really felt that he was trying to make up for lost time for the last 25 years of his life, trying to make the world a better place. And he really was, in that sense, a very driven man.
Justin, you probably want to take us somewhere else here. But
Well, now I'm wondering if Professor Arsenault was reading my notes here, because I had that quote highlighted. I mean, I think that is another commonality among these two giants. Yeah, as their fame rose, so did their anguish. But also there were so many other commonalities. You know, we know they were both famous. They were successful in different ways. They were both lauded as being attractive. I mean, that was something that was really surprising reading about Douglass, especially the way he was objectified and the way he was described by men and women as being, you know, desirable. But then too, you have this desire for both of them to have the freedom to be able to change their minds, the evolution of their thinking. I mean, when I began reading about Ashe, I honestly found myself frustrated by the younger Ashe, because I read Douglass first. So comparing the two, I mean, Ashe is just much more demure and conservative. Exactly. And so to hear him really sit on the sidelines during the early civil rights movement was frustrating for me. But I think they both have this evolution in their thinking and in their activism. And I was wondering if you could both kind of walk us through those shifts in their ideological thinking. And then I'll turn the floor to the audience.
well, the management, I'm so glad this came up, the management of anger, rage, really, in Douglass is a huge question. And in my book, I make, without getting too psychological about it, I make quite a case about how, yes, he escapes from slavery when he's 20 years old, but the scars in him from his slave experience were always with him. Douglass's great advantage over, well, the vast majority of other former slaves is that he gained this incredible ability with language, both written and spoken. First as an orator, then as a writer, then as an editor of his own newspaper for 16 years. Douglass's management of his rage and his anger came through words. And he said it explicitly at the time. That I have my newspaper to go to every week is how I survive, is how I can sustain myself. Well, he wasn't sustaining himself very well financially, that's another story. But his ability to put into words, to put into metaphor, often into biblical metaphor. It's another very big theme in my book, at least, is just how deeply steeped Douglass was, particularly in Old Testament story, in Hebrew prophets. He could really not craft a speech without some use, either directly quoting or paraphrasing the major prophets of the Old Testament. But his ability to process all of that into language was where he put his rage. But the young Douglass was at times a raging bull. People would describe his early lectures and when he's out on the circuit for the first time in the 1840s as like a thunderstorm hitting a room. When he comes back from England in 1847, where he's been for 18 months, this incredible flowering in his youthful life, he's still only in his 20s. He writes that first narrative when he's 27. Well, how old was Arthur when he wrote his first autobiography?
24.
24, God. Damn, he knew he was going somewhere. He already won one?
No.
No, not yet. Okay. Anyway, 27. Douglass writes his first autobiography. Goes to England, experiences this incredible flowering of his own personality, his psyche. He had never been anywhere where racism was so blunted. He ran into some racism in Ireland, Scotland, and England, but very, very little. And he was adored. He was lionized. He comes back a very angry young black man. And for a while, he flirted with the idea of staying there, but that didn't make sense since his wife Anna and now 4 children were back in Massachusetts. But when he arrives back, he is so angry in his speeches. He's going on the road with a speech where he keeps denouncing the United States in explicit terms. He says, I have no country. I have no patriotism. My country disowns me. I disown it. And his fellow Garrisonian abolitionists, the radicals, Wendell Phillips, for example, took him aside at one point and said, Frederick, can you tone it down? Oh my God, don't drive away the audience. And one newspaper reporter in Philadelphia at that point called him the demagogue in black. I knew that was a chapter title when I read that. Sometimes you know someone's a chapter title. He was a demagogue in black because he was so angry. He couldn't process anger. This disjuncture being treated as a human being by British reformers and by adoring audiences in particularly Scotland and Ireland.
Overly adoring sometimes.
Overly adoring indeed. Yeah, in Scotland, like Ireland, they adopted him. He only lived there 4 months. There are no less than 2 monuments today in Ireland. You'd think he'd lived there half of his life. He's like a saint in Ireland now. I don't know. The Irish have a thing. They need new saints or something. But in Scotland, he was so adored, they wrote songs and poems about him. You'd go into a little town in Scotland, be children on the street singing a song about Frederick Douglass. I mean, the kid's 27, 28 years old. And he comes back to the house of brutal racism in the United States, where the hope of ending slavery was a distant, bizarre sort of utopian hope in 1847 and 48. He comes back in the middle of the Mexican War, and he doesn't know where to put that anger except into the passion and the brilliance of words. And it's at that point he begins to transform from, slowly, but from the moral suasionist or moral advocate of the end of slavery into a much more politicized abolitionist by the early 1850s, even addressing the question of possible uses of violence. It's a real transformative time in his life. And as a biographer, Ray knows, and any of you know, have done biography, you're always trying to figure out the personality within a given context. The youth, and then into the 30s, and into his 40s, and then you've got, the context of the Civil War. And you're always trying to balance public and private, but also we're all evolving creatures. We're not the same as we were 5 years ago. We're not the same as we were an hour ago, probably. And we never remember anything accurately according to the neuroscientists. Every time you have a memory, it's new. Or you don't have it anymore. But anyway, he's always evolving, and that's an aspect. I wonder if Arthur was this way. Douglass is always that human being who was not only willing to change, he just sort of saw it as his natural state. He was always evolving into some new ideological turn, new strategic turn. Of course, when he gets older, he gets a little set in his ways too, and he gets into some awful fights with the next generation, who are very happy to try to knock him off. But he's always kind of an evolving thinker And I think that's also got to do with the fact that he never had any formal education. He wasn't tied to any school of thought, any school period that he ever went to. His mind was always, in fact, you know, when you're a biographer, you always have this list of things, right, Ray, that you just can't figure out. You couldn't find that letter or that story. It's just, you just can't, and you have to say, well, likely, or perhaps, you know, readers hate that. But then there are the other list of things that you just know. I know Douglass was essentially a sponge. If he met you, he'd figure out what he could learn from you as quick as he could. And if he'd learned about whatever he could learn from you, he might just discard you. He did that to a lot of people. And he could be arrogant about it. He wasn't always silly. He wasn't the nice guy of abolitionism. There really weren't any nice abolitionists, frankly. This idea that he was going to go out and be the civil spokesman of abolitionism, it just didn't fit that concept. Arthur Ashe was in a very different world.
Yeah,
The media demanded it of him.
could just add here, you know, Arthur was also a sponge, for sure, being such a great listener. But I don't think he ever discarded anyone. Had a very different personality. A number of the interviews that I conducted, one in particular I remember of Cliff Drysdale, who's now still announcing he listened to tennis, an expatriate South African, anti-apartheid South African, who's Arthur's great friend and involved in the anti-apartheid fight, which Arthur was such a big leader in the 1970s. So I'm interviewing Cliff Drysdale in the Waldorf Astoria lobby in New York, pretty grand. I hadn't even asked him a question yet, and he started crying, sobbing, and he apologized immediately and said, look, ESPN asked me to do an on-air interview yesterday, and I had to turn them down, because every time I think about Arthur, I start tearing up. And he said, look, this was the greatest man that I met in my lifetime. He changed my life forever. I only wish I could have been more like him. I mean, people have friends, but I kept running into that kind of statement of people who would have to discontinue the interview for a few minutes or a few seconds at least because they would tear up because, of course, it was so sad that, you know, Arthur would only be 75 today, same age as Joe Biden. He's been dead 26 years, only lived to be 49, as I said. So he was always evolving as well. I think I'd be remiss, though, if I didn't mention a couple things before we are out of time about Charlottesville and Arthur Ashe. Charlottesville really changed his life. I'm not sure he ever would have become Arthur Ashe without Charlottesville. Dr. Robert J. Johnson, some of you may have heard of, he was a black doctor in Lynchburg, kind of the king of junior tennis development for African Americans. He came through Charlottesville in 1950. They used to hold the interscholastic national championships here for many, many years. And he stopped and watched all these white players, there were no blacks then, and he went and talked to Teddy Penzel, who was the director of the Norfolk Port Authority and was kind of a racial liberal for his time, and said, if I brought a couple black players here next year, would you let them play? Penzel said, well, I'll see what I can do. University of Virginia had just admitted its first law student in 1950. And of course, the first undergraduate wouldn't graduate until 1960, African American. So Dr. Johnson starts bringing these young black players, and they just get destroyed. Just year after year after year. They just aren't competitive because they didn't start tennis at 6 years old in a country club the way the white players did. They didn't have the expert coaching and all that sort of thing. And the groups that Dr. Johnson would bring to Charlottesville, he had to promise that they would not stay overnight. They would go back to Lynchburg each night and then come back the next morning. They would not eat anything. They would not, basically they would be invisible. Finally, in 1959, they changed the rules and they said you could stay in the dorm overnight. And you could even go to the campus movie theater, and you can go to the cafeteria. So they're so excited they don't have to drive back to Arthur was one of these kids in 1959. So they check into the dorm, and there are 15 white boys there in various rooms when they can check in. By the time they woke up, the white boys were all gone. They were all gone. They just evacuated. And when they went to the theater, of course, they had to be in the Jim Crow section in the balcony, and sort of a bittersweet thing. But in 1961, Arthur came to play in the interscholastic tournament, and he just destroyed everyone. He beat his friend Jim Parker for the championship, and maybe coincidentally or maybe not, a few weeks later, the University of Virginia gave up its sponsorship of the interscholastic tournament, and it went to Williamstown, to Williams College in Massachusetts. And Sports Illustrated wrote a pretty devastating article about this, that if people like Arthur Ashe were going to win this tournament, they weren't maybe so interested in sponsoring it. And one of the things that Arthur had to deal with was his kind of love-hate relationship with Virginia and with Richmond. And I think it's really a token to the depth of his character that he was able to overcome all the hurts and the insults that he had to experience growing up, and going back to Richmond, and did everything he could for philanthropic things for Richmond. And I think it's very fitting now, of course, that they just renamed Boulevard Avenue for Arthur Ashe, and of course his controversial but wonderful statue on Monument Avenue. But to think when he was born in 1943 that someone like Arthur Ashe came from this kind of low-level working-class family in Richmond, in Jim Crow Richmond, would have his statue there next to Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee. And so he was somebody who could really forgive, maybe not forget. Just before the end of his life, in his last autobiography, he confessed that a lot of it is about his dealing with AIDS. But he said, you know, as bad as AIDS has been, it's nothing. It's not the greatest burden of my life. The greatest burden of my life has been race. And this is a man who had become a citizen of the world, who was a multimillionaire, who was a jet setter, and yet he was so conscious still of his race and of dealing with the problems of being an African American. And some of his closest friends, like his roommate Charlie Passerelle, a great player at UCLA, and Donald Dell, his agent, they were genuinely shocked by this. Because he sort of kept it to himself to a large extent, but he considered himself, like Douglass, to be a race man in a sense, and it was really a fundamental part of him. And of course, he ended up writing a 3-volume history of black athletes and did many op-ed columns. He was, of course, a columnist for the Washington Post for years, and never hesitated, I think, to jump into the fray to talk about these racial issues, which still bedevil us today.
Just one.
We're going to start
Okay.
questions from the audience.
Okay,
Is
fine.
that okay, Justin?
Oh, good. Good.
Well, I said a Jim Crow anecdote, but yeah, there are a dime a dozen, I'm afraid. Douglas got Jim Crowed more times than he could ever count. It happened early, it happened in the middle of his life, it happened at the end of his life. Hotels, trains, steamships, on and on and on and on. Early in his life, he would react usually with outrage, even physical outrage. But as he got old, 1870s, 1880s, he would encounter yet again the hotel owner or the restaurant that would not serve him. And there are at least a couple cases I've documented where he wouldn't be served in the dining room, and he would be told you can only eat in the kitchen. So he would stand as loud as he could in the dining room, and they'd say, "Where do you have your dogs? Take me to your dogs. I'll eat where the dogs eat." And pretty soon, the people in the restaurant feel sympathy for him. They're standing up and they're saying, "Oh, no, let the man sit here," you know.
Okay.
Found a way to use humor to get a decent meal in the dining room. Take me to your dog. Now, what he thought about having to do that when he went back to his room that night, assuming he stayed in that place, who knows? But this kind of racism you had to find, as all people have, over time, some way to process it without just putting up your fist and wanting to kill somebody.
Audience questions.
Okay, I'm going to ask the first question as I come up with the microphone to give it to the next person. I'm always curious what happens to the children of great men. Can you tell us anything about their children? And then I'll pass it to you.
Well, I'll be very brief. Arthur and Jeannie Ashe adopted a little girl at birth in 1986. Jeannie's a very prominent photographer in New York, and they named her Camera Ashe. She's now 34. She's the only person in the Ashe family, I think, that I did not interview. Mother thought it might be too difficult for her. She's still weepy, I guess you put it, about her father. And, there's some evidence from family members that she's never really recovered from her father's death. He was such a public person. And, of course, he lost his mother